Hi, I'm Shashank Bhargav, and you're listening to Three Things, the Indian Express news show. In this episode, we talk about the worst landslide that the state of Kerala has seen and what the situation is on the ground right now. We also talk about the story that the Wall Street Journal reported last week about Facebook not taking down content allegedly posted by BJP-linked individuals and groups, despite internally being flagged as promoting violence. But first, we talk about the Prime Minister's Independence Day speech. On Saturday, PM Modi gave his 7th consecutive Independence Day speech from the Red Fort in New Delhi. During his nearly 90 minutes address, he spoke at length on a number of issues, from the COVID-19 pandemic and India's border crisis at the LAC and LOC, to the end of Article 370 in Jammu and Kashmir, the Ram Temple construction in Ayodhya, and also his government's emphasis on infrastructure, piped water supply, empowerment of women, and the promise of optical fiber connectivity to 6 lakh villages in 1,000 days. But apart from all this, he also devoted a major part of his speech to Atmanirbhar Bharat. During this part, he said that the biggest lesson of self-reliance has been taught to us by the health sector following the COVID-19 outbreak. And underlining this point, he announced the launch of the National Digital Health Mission.
आज से एक बहुत बड़ा अभियान शुरू होने जा रहा है और उसमें टेक्नोलॉजी का भी बहुत बड़ा रोल रहेगा। आज से नेशनल डिजिटल हेल्थ मिशन उसका भी आरंभ किया जा रहा है।
Under this mission, he said, every Indian will be given a health ID, and this health ID will work like a health account of every Indian. This account will contain details of every test, every disease, the doctors you visited, the medicines you took, and the diagnosis. Adding that it will eliminate all difficulties related to appointments with the doctor, depositing money, or making a slip at the hospital.
प्रत्येक भारतीय को हेल्थ आईडी दी जाएगी। ये हेल्थ आईडी प्रत्येक भारतीय के स्वास्थ्य खाते की तरह काम करेगी। डॉक्टर से अपॉइंटमेंट हो, पैसा जमा करना हो, अस्पताल में पर्ची बनवाने की भागदौड़ हो, तमाम दिक्कतें नेशनल डिजिटल हेल्थ मिशन के माध्यम से अनेक मुसीबतों से मुक्ति मिलेगी।
In this segment, Prabha Raghavan, who reports on health and pharma for the Indian Express, joins us to talk about the idea behind the National Health ID, its proposed benefits, and the challenges that the government would face in trying to implement it. Prabha, what does the National Health ID system propose to do?
This National Health or Digital Health ID, it's expected to pretty much be the most crucial part of the National Digital Health Mission that the Prime Minister announced yesterday. The mission in itself aims at moving India towards a goal of universal health care or health coverage. And one of the ways to do that is to create a digital ecosystem. And in this ecosystem, what the Health ID does is it acts like a unique code for each patient that can be accessed by various healthcare providers. The gist is basically that with this ID, you can store all of your medical data, including your treatment records or prescriptions or diagnostic test results in one specific place digitally. And it can then be accessed across services, basically.
So once this is done, what are the kind of advantages that this is supposed to have over how things work right now?
Well, it's ideally supposed to be a more efficient way of providing treatment and healthcare services. I think one of the best ways for me to explain that is by giving an example of myself. I'm prone to losing prescriptions whenever I go to the doctor. And especially if it's a follow-up visit that I have to make 3 or 4 months later, I am definitely not going to find my prescription. I'm not going to find what the doctor had told me or had diagnosed. So if I don't have that information readily available, then that just sort of leads to a repeat of the same exercise of gathering information that the doctor can then use to treat me. But lately, over the last few years, I've been able to actually provide some of this information at a moment's notice. And that's basically because some of the services that I take have been moving towards a more digitized manner of record keeping, diagnostic tests that you can get by accessing an SMS code, or getting e-prescriptions. Those are all things that, at least for me personally, have helped. And I'm assuming that this has probably started helping a lot of other people who have access to technology, who have access to the internet, and feel like getting digital records is easier when they are visiting doctors, especially those in different cities, so that treatment can become more efficient and effective and transparent. No matter where in the country you go, ideally your ID can then be used by different doctors to pull up your records when you need it. So it could help with the continuity of treatment. I think one more thing that the government is also looking at is that this could possibly be a tool for collecting healthcare data to inform better policies. But we're going to have to look at the fine print of this to understand how they plan on implementing this or going about this.
Okay, so where does this idea come from? When was it first proposed?
Well, I think the genesis of the National Digital Health Mission, it comes from the National Health Policy of 2017, which basically aimed to create a digital health ecosystem as part of its objectives. And I think the most prominent work that we've seen towards this is a consultation that Niti Aayog had done back in 2018 to create a national health stack. At that point of time, as part of this national health stack, Niti Aayog had been looking at creating a digital health ID so that they could maybe reduce medical errors and improve the quality of care provided to patients in India.
Okay, so you mentioned that the system will require a unique ID for everyone, right? So is the government planning to use the Aadhaar infrastructure that also has a unique identification for most people? Is it planning to use that system for the National Health ID?
From what I understand, Aadhaar will be used to create the unique health ID. So when you go to one of the health information providers that are in charge of creating and educating people about these unique health IDs, you will be asked to provide identification such as your Aadhaar number and your phone number. So they're going to use information like this in order to create your health ID. But there have been questions about why the government can't just use the Aadhaar ID as your unique health ID. And the answer to that is not very clear at the moment, but one of the reasons could possibly be the fact that creating this unique health ID is voluntary. So you don't have to get this ID made if you don't want to have your records digitized, if you don't want to partake in this scheme. As a patient, you don't have to get this done. And so I think that is possibly one of the reasons at the moment.
And the other question is that, is our current health infrastructure equipped to integrate such a system?
This one's not so easy to answer because on the one hand, we have a growing ecosystem of healthcare startups and services that have been involved in providing facilities like diagnostics, pharmacies, and telemedicine. And this is mainly privately owned. Our public healthcare infrastructure, from what we've all seen over the last few years, is still in a process of upgradation. And we're likely going to see more preparedness for a scheme like this because of the Ayushman Bharat PMJAY scheme that had been rolled out 2 years ago. When it first came out, there had been a lot of hiccups where technology was concerned, where creating the cards for the beneficiaries were concerned, where accessing the records or ensuring that each beneficiary had been identified properly. There were several issues on that front, but I think over the last 2 years, these issues have been worked out and they're constantly being worked on by the National Health Authority that implements this scheme. So on the one hand, we do see, a potential infrastructure that is in place that now needs to be integrated. But on the other hand, we also don't really have clear regulations in a lot of these areas, especially where our data protection laws are concerned. We don't really have anything there to ensure data privacy, confidentiality, and the security of our digital data. And I think that's where a lot of the challenges that we're anticipating are going to arise. We also don't really have clear regulations on things like e-pharmacies. And, this is something that I've been covering for the last 4 years or so. And it's been in the works for the last 4 years. And it really hasn't seen the light of day right now. This proposal is with a group of high-level ministers. And e-pharmacies, as part of this national digital health mission, is one of the core blocks. And I think because of a lack of clarity on the regulations for this, the rollout of especially this aspect is going to be delayed because we don't really know how online pharmacies can be regulated at this point of time. So it is a very mixed bag of issues. And so we're going to have to see what hiccups the government will face in implementing a scheme like this.
And when does the government plan to start this system?
Well, technically, the mission has been launched because the Prime Minister announced its launch on Independence Day. So basically, we're going to see it piloted across 6 union territories. And once they get a better sense of what works, what doesn't work, they're going to use those learnings to then expand it to other states. We're not really going to see it in union territories like Delhi and Jammu and Kashmir just yet, but we're going to see it in at least 6 union territories to start with.
Dear listeners, sorry for this interruption, but before we move on to the rest of the show, I just wanted your quick attention. One of the big reasons people say they like this show is because it helps them understand the news better. It provides them with the context they need to see the bigger picture. And there is perhaps no other place that does that better than Indian Express's Explained section. We on 3 Things refer to the section regularly, and it helps us make this show. If you're a regular reader of Indian Express, you know how useful the Explained section can be, especially when you're looking for in-depth analysis by the right experts. You can log on to indianexpress.com/explained and access the coverage 24/7. Explained by Indian Express, where news that matters is explained by experts who know the subject. Now, back to the show. And next we talk about Kerala. A few days ago, the Idukki district witnessed what was the state's worst landslide. The disaster, which took place in the remote hamlet of Pettimodi, has killed at least 70 people. The landslide occurred after the region saw a bout of extreme rainfall. The landslide, which generated a river of mud and debris, washed over the homes of people living there. In this segment, Vishnu Verma, who has been reporting on this story for the newspaper and who visited the region, joins us to talk about the situation on the ground. Vishnu, before we talk about the damage it has done, could you first give a sense of the region where the landslide took place?
Yes. So the village of Pettimudi, which is the site of the landslide, is a small hamlet in the upper reaches of the Western Ghats. It's located in Kerala's Idukki district, and it's adjoining the very famous and popular Iravikulam National Park, which is home to the Nilgiri Tahr, which is a sort of mountain deer that is found only in the Western Ghats. It's a village that is nestled among tea gardens, and these tea estates largely are monopolized under the Kanandevan plantation hills, which belong to the Tatas. So that's the sort of location of the place where it occurred.
Now, this is perhaps the worst landslide that the state has ever seen. What kind of damage has it caused?
Yeah, so we are looking at a casualty figure that could go up to 70 lives. Only about 58 bodies have been retrieved so far. Around 12 people have been rescued. So that's about 68 is the total number of people that have been either rescued or dead. Another 10 to 12 bodies are still to be found. So that makes around 70 people, which is highest casualty figure in any landslide in Kerala. Last year, we had a similar landslide in Kavalapara in Malappuram district, where about 60 people died. Obviously, this is the place where the landslide has occurred. It's supposed to be about 5-kilometer long. That's how long the debris sort of came down from a hill above. And it sort of completely buried these 4 rows of living quarters in which these tea plantation workers and the estate workers lived. In the local language in Malayalam, it's called layams. So these are like 4 sets of liams in which about 82 people lived. And so all these 4 liams were completely crushed, washed away. A couple of buildings on either side of the plantation have been partially affected as well, but people in those settlements have escaped just in the nick of time. So that's the kind of damage that has occurred.
And you also write that, a landslide of this scale is not something that people like living there expected, right? Even though the region might be prone to such things.
So obviously locals cannot sort of come to terms with the fact that a landslide could take place there. As I've written in my story, the locals there or the tea plantation workers who were more concerned with the flooding of a nearby river. So there's a small river that flows by the side of the settlement. And usually in the monsoon, sort of river floods and the water comes up to these settlements. So even last year's monsoon, the people had to relocate to these relief camps when the water comes up. So they were more concerned with the flooding from the river rather than the possibility of a landslide. And one of the reasons is because it's a tea plantation area, and because there's not a large sort of a big hill that sort of hovers above the settlement, the possibility of a landslide never sort of crossed their minds, And tea gardens, they don't normally witness landslides in Kerala. It has never happened before. The roots of the tea plant are rather strong. They're able to hold the soil together, which is possibly one of the reasons. But we have to look here that the amount of rainfall that they got, the village of Pettimudi and other nearby estates, on that night of August 6th was massive. According to the Tamil Nadu weathermen, we got around 616 millimeter within a 24-hour window in that particular area, which is massive for a Western Ghat region. And also, if you look at the Madhav Gadgil panel report, this region is classified as a ecologically sensitive zone, which is prone to landslides. It has never happened before. A major landslide of this magnitude has never happened in that area. But when you get rainfall as massive as that, it could happen. So that's the sort of theory that geologists and disaster management officials are sort of looking at.
And, the rescue efforts and all of this have been particularly challenging. Could you talk about that? And also, right after it happened, power and communication lines were snapped. How much did that contribute to the problem?
Yeah, the rescue operations were extremely challenging because for the past 4 days in that area, so right from about August 2nd to August 6th, the day that the landslide occurred, there was no power in that area. There were no communication lines. There's not a mobile tower. So usually, if you want to talk to people in that area, they have mobile phones, but they only get reception when you come downhill. So that's the sort of remoteness of the area. It's extremely remote. You have to travel up a small, tiny mountain road to reach that village. And on the day that this rainfall occurred, one of the bridges that connect the sort of mainland with this particular hill, with this particular area, was swept away. So if you had rescue operations, if you wanted rescue agencies to come to this area quickly, they had to turn around and go through a much longer route that obviously takes a lot more time. This occurred on the night of August 6th, but the news of the landslide only reached Munnar and other nearby towns by the morning of the next day because there were obviously no power and communication lines. There was no way people could tell others in the outside world that something of this has happened. So if you had rescue agencies reaching there within 1 or 2 hours, maybe we could have rescued a lot more people. Maybe that's why it has sort of pushed the casualty figure up.
And what are the kind of steps that the government has taken since then?
So, like I said, on the morning of 7th August, we had 2 teams of the NDRF Fire Force units pitching in. So it was on that particular day that we had 12 people rescued from that landslide. Most of them had come out of the settlement through some way or the other. So there's one young man who got rescued because he had gone out of his house and he was able to take out his family just in the nick of time when his house got washed away. So through rescue operations, obviously the government is still trying to retrieve as many bodies as possible, but there's very little possibility that bodies are going to be found at the exact landslide itself. Like I said, there's a river that flows by the settlement. So there's huge possibility that most of the bodies now, which are yet to be retrieved, are likely to have been washed away by the river and possibly into a dam that goes further downstream. So the likelihood of finding more bodies is difficult. It's challenging. I'm not saying it's improbable, but it's going to be difficult. As far as the government moves are concerned, the chief minister and other top ministers have visited the area, and they've promised 5 lakh compensation to the families of the deceased, land, and a home of their own for all of these families who are affected by the landslide. That's the sort of government response.
You went to the region last week to report. How did things look on the ground?
It was an extremely grim sort of a picture. I mean, if you saw pictures of the particular tea plantation estate, the lions, and if you saw the picture of what remains now, it's completely heartbreaking to even, it's difficult to believe that there were so many people living in that area, which is now completely washed away. So the rescue operations are going on. When I went there, they were proceeding. There are these families of the deceased who were standing by the landslide site, sort of looking for information of their missing and loved ones. The truly heartbreaking picture is that many of the families have been completely washed away. There's this young man who lost nearly 40 of his extended family. He was able to rescue his mother, his sister, and his sister's son, but he lost three of his father's brothers, their families, their wives and children. So obviously, many of the families, generations of families, have been washed away. It's a very heartbreaking sight, and I remember so many people from there telling me that they don't want to live there anymore because now it feels like a graveyard, where these bodies are lying. So they don't want to live there anymore, and they want to relocate to somewhere else. The landslide has also claimed about 20 children, out of which majority of them were school-going children. Now, in these areas, usually the children stay in government hostels because this is a very remote sort of hamlet. Going from there to Nar or anywhere else for schooling is extremely tough and challenging. So many of these parents, they send their kids to hostels, hostels which are run by government or private. And so, the teachers were saying that if we didn't have a lockdown, if we didn't have a coronavirus situation, most of these children would have been in these hostels. They would have been safe, they would have survived. But because of the lockdown, all the children had come home to their village and they all died. So you have numerous accounts of schools losing their children, many young children from nearby estates losing their friends. So yeah, it's a very heartbreaking sort of account that you can find there.
And in the end, we talk about Facebook. Last week, the newspaper Wall Street Journal reported a story that highlights the challenges of monitoring content on social media platforms. The newspaper reported that at least 4 individuals and groups linked with the BJP had posted content on Facebook that the company had flagged internally for promoting or participating in violence. But Facebook India's public policy director Ankhi Das told staff members that punishing violations by BJP politicians would damage the company's business prospects in the country. It is important to know that India is Facebook's biggest global market in terms of the number of users. One of the individuals that the story cites is MLA T. Raja Singh of the Hyderabad constituency. Singh, according to the report, had said that Rohingya Muslim immigrants should be shot, called Muslim traitors, and threatened to raise mosques. In this segment, we speak to Karishma Mehrotra, who reports on the intersection of technology and politics for the newspaper, about her takeaways from the story and what she found out while looking into the post of MLA T. Raja Singh.
So I looked at Raja Singh's name on Facebook because I was just, curious. And there were about 7 or 8 different profiles and pages associated with his name. And the one official account that I found had been taken down, which is mentioned in the Wall Street Journal article. It said that one, Facebook took down some of Raja Singh's posts after Wall Street Journal had reached out. And 2, that they said T. Raja Singh is not allowed to have an official or verified account anymore.
Karishma also called up Singh, who told her that none of these accounts were run by him and that his account was taken down before the Telangana Assembly elections in December 2018, and he hasn't been able to make an official account since then. He said that since then, many of his supporters, party workers, and other individuals have been making pages in his name. Singh also denied the post that the Wall Street Journal talked about. While reviewing Singh's case, the Facebook staff had concluded that he should be banned from the platform under a policy called Dangerous Individuals and Organizations. Facebook has previously used this policy during the 2018 communal riots in Sri Lanka and had also used it in the Northeast Delhi riots that took place earlier this year.
So the other aspect of this that I'm interested in, and yet I haven't found many answers in, but I think it matters for the story, is that because I had found that T. Raja Singh has some 7-8 different profiles or pages, and the BJP MLA himself has claimed that he doesn't run any of his pages. They're all run by party workers. That led me to sort of wonder about, even in a situation where you find that these pages or profiles are espousing or promoting violence, then how do you categorize his profile under the dangerous individuals and organizations policy? So Facebook hasn't provided more clarity on this, but I think this example shows the gray area in which these policy decisions are made, because as I said, T. Raja Singh, his official account was taken down in December 2018, right before the Telangana elections. And since then, there is no official or verified account by his name. And he's claiming he's not running any of these. So that example sort of shows us these content policy decisions are made with quite a bit of context to take care of as well. And again, this is where the structures within the organization matter about how you make such a decision.
The other person that has come under the spotlight is Facebook India's public policy director, Anki Das, who, according to the Wall Street Journal, had told Facebook that penalizing violations by BJP leaders would cost the company. This is not the first time that Das has been in the news. Previously, news stories have reported her as having ties with the BJP and the RSS. Karishma says that Das's role in Facebook itself raises questions.
If we look at Das's position in Facebook, she's the public policy director. A person in this position has multiple roles, two of which will be that she has to work with government and bureaucrats and politicians. And she is often the face of Facebook for the government of India. And she shows up in parliamentary committee meetings. She shows up at the IT ministry meeting with Ravi Shankar Prasad. So she is interacting closely with the government.
So on one hand, she's the face of the government for Facebook, but on the other hand, it's clear that she also has a part to play in deciding what content is on the platform.
So it's interesting to me that, you have both of those roles coming under one position within the company. And I often do characterize Facebook as a tech/media company, although that is debatable. That's not something that we can say so concretely, especially since legally there are laws that protect a company like Facebook for having liability for what's on their platform. So the laws that apply to Facebook are a bit different than the laws that would apply to, say, the Indian Express, and they are governed a bit differently. But, for the sake of discussion, if in some ways Facebook exhibits some amount of qualities that are like a media company or a newspaper or a newsroom, and they are moderating what content is on there and what content should not be on there according to not only their own content policy about, hate speech or terrorism or fake accounts or child pornography, they're also interacting closely with the government as a business. And so that's a complication that I think many different businesses have had to deal with. And so I think an important part of this conversation is understanding how does that look like in a place like Facebook, and how do local offices like Facebook India navigate that. So I think those are some of the things that popped into my mind after reading the Wall Street Journal article and after doing a little bit of, talking to Facebook and talking to some of the names being mentioned in that article. Those are quite important things to keep in mind.
You were listening to Three Things by The Indian Express. Today's show was written and produced by me, Shashank Bhargav, and as always was edited and mixed by our producer, Joshua Thomas. Before we go, here's another reminder to check out Indian Express's Explain section. You can log on to indianexpress.com/explain and find in-depth analysis by the right experts. It has everything you need to know to understand the news better and see the bigger picture. If you like this show, then you can subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. You can also recommend the show to someone you think will like it, share it with a friend or someone in your family. It's the best way for people to get to know about us. You can also tweet us at Express Audio and write to us at podcast@indianexpress.com.